She was standing on the street corner, her briefcase clutched tightly, mind racing with the day's work, but in a flash, everything spiraled out of control. Two police officers approached, hands hovering near their belts, sneering words slicing through the air. "You don't belong here," one muttered. Confusion, fear, disbelief all at once. She tried to explain, tried to prove who she was, but the officers wouldn't listen until a single word shattered their arrogance, who she really was. And in that moment, the street became a courtroom, her career and dignity hanging by a thread. How did this happen? And who would pay the price? Rain-slicked streets glistened under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. The evening air smelled of wet asphalt and gasoline, the kind of night that makes your nerves jitter with anticipation. She pulled her coat tighter, stepping quickly, hoping to reach her car before the storm picked up. But before she could take another step, a shadow loomed, two figures in dark uniforms blocking her path. "Evening, ma'am," one of the officers said, a forced politeness in his tone that barely masked the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Her stomach twisted. She had been stopped before, but not like this. She raised her briefcase slightly. "I live nearby, just heading home." The taller officer leaned in, eyes scanning her from head to toe, lingering a second too long. "Really? Looks like you're out of place." Out of place. The words struck like ice. Her pulse spiked. She opened her mouth to protest, to remind them she was a citizen with rights, a professional who spent her days enforcing the law herself. But before she could finish, the other officer reached for his flashlight, shining it in her face. "Step aside. We're just doing our job," he said, tone sharp. Her hands trembled, not with fear of their authority, but at the injustice in their eyes, the presumption in their gestures. She was calm in courtrooms, used to commanding rooms full of people, but here, on this wet street, she was being treated like a suspect, for no reason other than the color of her skin. "Please," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not doing anything illegal. You can check my ID." The taller officer laughed, a short, bitter sound that made her blood run cold. "ID? Let's see it then." She handed over her badge, the state attorney ID that usually commanded respect. The moment their eyes landed on the insignia, their smirks faltered. Confusion crossed their faces, but it was quickly masked with irritation. You're... One stammered, trying to collect himself. Her voice cut through the tension. "Yes, state attorney. I handle cases against law enforcement misconduct." Silence fell. The rain pounded harder, drumming on the asphalt like impatient fingers. Around them, the city seemed to hold its breath. The second officer shifted his weight, avoiding eye contact. The first one swallowed hard, clearly realizing the gravity of their mistake, the humiliation that could follow. You need to," he muttered. But no words could fix the moments already lost, the assumptions already made. She straightened, raising her head high. Every instinct screamed at her to storm off, to leave before the adrenaline surge overwhelmed her. But she couldn't. She had to make them see what their prejudice had cost them, what their snap judgment had nearly destroyed. "I suggest you check yourselves before you decide who belongs where," she said, voice calm but cutting, every syllable sharp like a gavel hitting wood, "because the law applies to everyone, even those sworn to uphold it." The taller officer looked down at the ground, cheeks flushed with shame. The second one avoided her gaze entirely. Around them, the street returned to its regular rhythm. Distant car horns, the occasional shout of someone rushing to escape the storm, the steady drip of water from the awnings above. But she felt the weight of the moment, heavy and tangible. And yet, even as she walked away, something inside her churned. This wasn't just a personal indignity. It was a symbol of something larger, something insidious that persisted in every city, in every neighborhood. And she knew, as a state attorney, she couldn't let it go unchallenged. That night, as she drove home through the rain-slicked streets, her mind raced with questions. How could she turn this incident into change? How could she confront the officers without making it personal? And more importantly, how many people had faced this same humiliation without the power, the badge, or the courage to stand up? The answer wasn't easy, but she knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't going to stay hidden. And the moment she stepped into her office the next morning, she began plotting a course that would expose more than just two officers. It would reveal a system built on assumptions, bias, and unchecked authority. Her fight had just begun. The next morning, the office buzzed with its usual activity. Phones ringing, clerks shuffling papers, interns rushing to meet deadlines. But she couldn't focus on any of it. Every memory of last night's confrontation replayed in her mind, like a film stuck on a loop. The officer's sneers, the way the taller one's eyes narrowed before faltering, the subtle arrogance that had assumed she was a criminal just because of her skin, she felt it in her bones. She set her briefcase on her desk and opened her laptop, the familiar hum grounding her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, reluctant but deliberate. This wasn't just about one stop and frisk. It was about every person who had ever been misjudged, humiliated, or dismissed because of race. She couldn't let it slide. Her assistant knocked lightly. "Morning, ma'am. You okay?" She forced a calm smile. "Yes, just reviewing a case. Can you pull up all recent complaints involving those officers?" The assistant nodded, a little surprised but obedient, and started typing. Within minutes, a stack of reports appeared. Minor infractions, complaints of harassment, dozens of routine stops that ended with citizens feeling powerless. The pattern was unmistakable. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. Her mind raced, connecting dots. These officers weren't just careless, they were part of a culture that allowed assumptions and prejudice to dictate who was questioned, who was frisked, and who was ignored. And the sad truth? Most victims didn't have her leverage, her position, or her knowledge of the law. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from a trusted colleague. "Heard what happened last night. Be careful. Don't let this become about ego. Focus on the system." She typed back quickly, "I know. That's exactly why I have to act." By noon, she had pulled together a preliminary report and drafted a memo to her superior. Every word was precise, every fact verified. She wasn't here to settle a personal score. She was documenting systemic failure, exposing what many preferred to ignore. Meanwhile, word of the incident had begun to circulate. Whispers at precincts, murmurs in local newsrooms. A few officers laughed it off, shaking their heads as if embarrassed by the mix-up. Others were quieter, uneasy, sensing the storm that might be coming. Back at the office, she reviewed body cam footage she had requested through official channels. The officer's behavior was clear, unmistakable. Smirks, dismissive gestures, and a refusal to listen even when she introduced herself as the state attorney. It was shocking how easily arrogance had turned into prejudice, how quickly authority had masked itself as entitlement. Her phone rang. She answered, her voice steady, professional. It was her superior. "I saw the report," he said. "This could get messy. Are you sure you want to pursue it?" She paused. The question hung in the air. Pursue it? Yes. But what would it cost her? What would it cost them? And what would it reveal about the system she had sworn to uphold? "I'm sure," she said finally. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. And about the people who don't have my badge, my voice, or my platform." He sighed. "All right. Just be careful. You know how this looks from their side." She hung up, her jaw tight. "From their side?" she whispered to herself. "No, from the right side." The following days were a whirlwind of legal research, internal investigations, and careful documentation. She met with other officers who had witnessed similar misconduct, reviewed dozens of past complaints, and compiled evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Every case reinforced the same grim reality: unchecked assumptions, a culture of intimidation, and the casual use of race as a measure of suspicion. But there was also resistance. Emails filled with subtle warnings, colleagues questioning her methods, even friends advising her to let it go for her own safety. The pressure mounted, but so did her resolve. And then came the moment she had been waiting for. A meeting scheduled with the two officers, the same men who had humiliated her on that wet street. The same men who had assumed she was less than before seeing the badge that demanded respect. She knew this confrontation would not be easy, and it could very well turn ugly, but it was necessary. As she prepared, she rehearsed every question, every fact, every point of law. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. The street corner incident was no longer just a story of personal humiliation. It was the spark that could ignite change, the moment that would force those in power to reckon with their bias. And in that charged anticipation, one thought remained. Would they even realize the gravity of their actions, or would arrogance blind them until it was too late? The room was set, evidence laid out, cameras positioned, witnesses ready, and she stepped in, ready to turn a moment of humiliation into a statement that would echo far beyond that rainy street corner. The room smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a neutral space designed for discussion, but today it felt charged, electric, like a courtroom before a verdict. She walked in, briefcase in hand, eyes scanning the two officers sitting stiffly across from her. Their postures screamed unease, a tension they tried to hide behind forced professionalism. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but sharp, slicing through the silence. "I appreciate you both coming." The taller officer shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. We just want to clear up what happened," he said, voice shaky. She nodded slowly. "Then let's do that. I want to make one thing clear before we begin. This isn't personal. This is about accountability, about respect, about the law you swore to uphold. And last week, on that street corner, you failed." A flicker of defensiveness crossed the second officer's face. We were just following protocol," he muttered. She leaned forward, letting her eyes lock on theirs. "Protocol doesn't give you permission to humiliate someone, to assume guilt based on race. You saw me, a black woman standing there, and, before knowing anything about me, you judged, mocked, and harassed me. And your actions have consequences, not just for me, but for the community you swore to serve." The room grew colder. The officers shifted, uneasily, their attempts at composure, cracking under the weight of truth. She opened her briefcase and laid out the evidence. Body cam footage, prior complaints, witness statements. Each item spoke louder than words. "Look at this," she said, pressing play on the body cam footage. The officers winced as the video displayed their smirks, the dismissive gestures, the refusal to listen even when she introduced herself as the state attorney. "Do you recognize this behavior? Do you understand how this looks, how it feels, to those subjected to it?" The taller officer swallowed hard, his face pale. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean?" she interrupted, voice rising. Slightly, her emotions barely contained. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You didn't mean to humiliate me, but you did. And this is bigger than you, or me, or even your careers. This is about trust. Trust that the public places in law enforcement. And every time an officer acts on bias, that trust is shattered." The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the projector. Even the witnesses sitting in the back felt the tension, the weight of the moment pressing down like the stormy night when it all began. Then she leaned back, letting the silence sink in. I have a choice here. I could let this go, chalk it up to a mistake, but I won't. Because this isn't just about a single incident. It's about a system that allows bias to persist unchecked, and it's about making sure those without power, without a platform, aren't the only ones paying the price. The second officer's hands trembled slightly on the table. The taller officer's jaw tightened, as if the words were cutting through layers of denial and arrogance. She could see the realization settling in, the awareness that their actions, however unconscious, had consequences they hadn't anticipated. I will be filing a formal complaint, she said, closing her briefcase with a decisive snap. And I will ensure that this case is reviewed thoroughly, not just internally, but by oversight authorities. This is your chance to reflect, to learn, to do better. But make no mistake, this is serious, and it will be made public if necessary. Her words lingered in the room, heavy and undeniable. The officers nodded reluctantly, silent now, the weight of accountability pressing down like a physical force. The tension was unbearable, yet it was necessary. Justice rarely arrived without discomfort. As she stood to leave, she looked at them one last time. Remember this feeling. Remember the fear, the embarrassment, the shame. Let it guide you toward change, because the people you serve deserve nothing less. The meeting ended. She walked out into the bright hallway, heart pounding, adrenaline slowly ebbing. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the storm of truth that had just erupted behind closed doors. But for her, for those who had no voice, and for everyone who had ever been humiliated simply for existing, the fight had just begun. And in that moment, she realized something profound. One encounter, one badge, one story, even one person standing, firm, could make a difference. But change was never easy. Change demanded courage, accountability, and an unwillingness to look away. And as she stepped outside into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on her face after days of rain, she asked herself the question that would fuel her mission from that day forward. How many more had suffered quietly, waiting for someone to stand, and how many more would she fight for before the system learned the weight of its own bias? By the next morning, the ripple from that rainy street corner had turned into a wave. Word had spread within law enforcement circles, through social media, and into local newsrooms. A few outlets picked it up cautiously at first, framing it as an unusual encounter between a state attorney and police officers. But as the footage and reports were reviewed, the story's real weight became impossible to ignore. She sat at her desk, scrolling through comments and articles. Some were supportive, voices praising her courage, calling for accountability, applauding her refusal to stay silent. Others were venomous, anonymous posts questioning her integrity, mocking her for overreacting or making a scene. But she barely noticed. Her focus was on the bigger picture, the system that allowed the officers' initial assumptions, the thousands who had no badge to shield them from humiliation, the fear and silence that persisted in every neighborhood. Her phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, emails from advocacy groups, and even messages from colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also a powerful tool. She knew how to channel it, how to use it to amplify the very point she had been trying to make. Bias, no matter how subtle or unconscious, had real consequences. Meanwhile, the officers themselves faced scrutiny like never before. Internal reviews were launched, interviews conducted, and body cam footage replayed countless times. The taller officer, once brimming with arrogance, now sat silently in meetings with his superiors, aware that his actions were no longer defensible. The second officer paced, replaying her words in his mind, realizing the humiliation he had inflicted might haunt his career, and deservedly so. Despite the tension, she remained steady. She began coordinating with community leaders, legal teams, and advocacy organizations to push for systemic reform. Meetings, strategy sessions, and public statements consumed her days. But she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about one stop and frisk. It was about changing a culture that allowed prejudice to persist quietly, unchallenged. Late one evening, she received a call from a young woman who had experienced similar harassment months earlier, but hadn't dared to speak up. Her voice trembled as she recounted the encounter, the fear, the humiliation. But by the end of the call, she expressed a new sense of hope, inspired by the attorney's courage. That moment struck her harder than any legal brief or meeting. The human impact was real, immediate, and undeniable. The media attention intensified. Local news stations interviewed experts on law enforcement bias, social media discussions exploded, and op-eds dissected the cultural and systemic factors at play. She appeared on camera once, measured and composed, recounting the street corner incident not as a personal vendetta but as evidence of a larger problem. Her words resonated. Her presence reminded the public, and the officers themselves, that accountability was not optional. Then came the day of the official review. The two officers were called in again, this time facing not just their superiors, but a panel of oversight officials. She watched from a nearby room, briefcase in hand, nerves taut but resolve unwavering. When the panel concluded, the officers received formal reprimands, mandatory bias training, and an official record of their misconduct. Justice, at least in this case, had been served, but she knew the battle was far from over. As she left the calm building, she paused outside, the evening sun casting long shadows on the pavement. The city felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had forced a reckoning, a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. She thought of the countless others who had endured similar experiences silently, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed again, another message from a colleague. "You're changing the narrative. Keep going." She smiled, knowing that change rarely came easily or quickly. It demanded courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand in uncomfortable places. The incident on that wet street corner had started as a personal affront, but it had become a catalyst for awareness, accountability, and dialogue. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of orange and red, she realized something profound. One person's courage, one refusal to stay silent, could spark a movement. One voice could challenge assumptions, confront bias, and demand justice, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been silenced. And yet, as she walked home that evening, she couldn't help but wonder how many others still suffered, quietly, waiting for someone brave enough to stand up. How many stories went untold, unheard, dismissed as ordinary? The fight wasn't over. It had only begun. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and public attention. Every time she stepped into a room, cameras or colleagues or community members were waiting, eager to hear her perspective, to see the woman who had refused to be humiliated on that rainy street corner. Yet through it all, she remained grounded, reminded constantly that this wasn't about her. It was about accountability, justice, and the countless lives affected by unchecked bias. One afternoon, she returned to that very street, the place where it had all begun. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick but sparkling under the afternoon sun. She looked around at the familiar buildings, the street lights, the distant hum of traffic, and she imagined every person who had ever walked here, judged unfairly, stopped, or questioned without cause. She remembered their fear, their confusion, their silence, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders once more. The officers' disciplinary actions had made headlines, but that was only a small piece of the story. More important were the conversations sparked in homes, offices, and schools. People were talking openly about bias, about assumptions, about the subtle ways prejudice affected daily life. She received letters from strangers, black parents thanking her for setting an example, young professionals sharing experiences that mirrored hers, even some officers who admitted they had never truly reflected on their own assumptions. It was messy, uncomfortable, and necessary. One evening, she sat at her desk, the city lights twinkling outside her office window. She thought about the encounter itself, the fear, the anger, the momentary helplessness. And then she thought about the power that came from standing firm. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the refusal to be paralyzed by it. Courage was speaking up when the world expected silence, challenging authority when it had gone astray, and insisting on justice when no one else would. Her phone buzzed. Another message, from the young woman she had spoken to weeks earlier. It read simply, "Thank you. Because of you, I feel seen. I feel heard. I feel like I matter." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. This was why she had fought. This was why she had refused to let humiliation pass unnoticed. And in that moment, she understood something fundamental. The fight against prejudice wasn't about one incident, one person, or one badge. It was about creating a world where respect was automatic, not conditional, where dignity was a given, not a privilege, where justice didn't wait for someone to have the courage or the position to demand it. The street corner incident had started as a moment of fear and anger, but it had ended as a catalyst for change. She had turned humiliation into accountability, anger into action, and silence into a platform for awareness. And though the fight was far from over, she knew she had lit a spark that could inspire countless others to stand, speak, and act. As she walked home that evening, the city alive with the hum of life, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She thought of the future, of the cases she would take on, of the policies she would push to change, and she knew one truth with absolute clarity. Courage mattered. Voice mattered. Justice mattered. And sometimes one person refusing to be silenced could shift the course of countless lives. The streetlights flickered overhead, and she took a deep breath, feeling both the weight of what had happened and the hope for what was yet to come. She had faced bias, fear, and arrogance head-on, and had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, determined, and ready for the battles still ahead. The story ended here, on this street, but its impact would ripple far beyond it. Because in every act of courage, in every refusal to stay silent, the fight against prejudice continued. And the question remained for all of us. When faced with injustice, who will stand? Who will speak? Who will act? Her journey had started with fear, but it would not end until justice was more than an ideal. It would continue as long as people dared to fight for what was right.